Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Transcending Humanity podcast. Thank you all for joining us today. This is episode 19, and it is all about gender diversity. I'm your host for today's episode. My name is Jess Bradley. My pronouns are they, them. And I am joined today by our lovely executive producer, Vanessa Joy, and our special guest, Shay Barnes, who I'll introduce in just a moment. But let's start with Vanessa. Would you like to introduce yourself? And would you also humor me with my icebreaker question today, a little summer question, which is, what is your favorite kind of ice cream?
Oh dear. Well, I am Vanessa. I am the obnoxious one on the podcast, and I'm also the one that does all of the editing and everything. So I suppose you can call me the executive producer, a wonderful volunteer position. You can find me on pretty much all socials except for the evil one at Venestradio. But my favorite ice cream, I like a dark chocolate brownie ice cream. So like a dark chocolate ice cream with brownie, and then if I can find some raspberry sauce and hot fudge to put on it, that'd be amazing. And if I could put it on top of a brownie, that's even more amazing. So
Wow,
very specific, I know.
that sounds really delicious.
It's really good. There's an ice cream place near me that they don't have the raspberry, but they do everything else. So it's very good.
Yeah.
I can almost taste that.
Yes. Now I'm craving it.
This is why I'm not losing weight.
All right. Well, thank you so much for co-hosting with me today, Vanessa. And now our guest for this episode is, as I said before, the fabulous Shay Barnes. Shay, could you please introduce yourself, and also please tell us your favorite ice cream flavor?
Lovely. So I'm Shay Barnes. My pronouns are she, her, they, them. And so, gosh, favorite ice cream flavor. Do you know what? I think it might be like a cherry, which might sound crazy. It's kind of one of those things that you don't get very often, but when you get a really good cherry ice cream with actual like chunks of delicious fruit in there, then yeah. That's pretty good stuff. And so, yes, I'm a gender diversity educator and trainer. And I deliver talks and workshops, have an online course, and do lots of things like that, introducing slightly different framework for understanding gender diversity. So, yeah, that's me.
Yay. Well, thank you. Thank you for that introduction. And that ice cream also sounds really delicious with chunks of cherry. I don't know if I've ever had a cherry ice cream, but I will definitely try it if I come across it now that I got that great recommendation. Well, I asked Shay to be on this episode today because I have been impressed by their work on gender diversity, most of which I've seen on LinkedIn so far, but I am looking forward to doing your course. Just haven't had the time yet. But I thought it would be fun to talk more about your work here on the pod. And I'm going to mention, to prep for this conversation, I listened to the most recent episode of the LinkedIn Live event series, Non-Binary Corner. That is hosted by Margie Marchetti, Lou Costello, and B. Gilmore. Apologies if I mispronounced any of those names, but those are the hosts of Non-Binary Corner. I just want to let our listeners know about that. If you like this conversation, check out that one too, because it was really great. So without further ado, let's get into it. I've got some questions for Shay. And really the first one is, what led you to this path of becoming a gender diversity trainer?
Yeah, so there's two strands there, aren't there? The gender diversity and the trainer thing. So training has always been something, and I just want to apologize straight up. I have a little bit of a bug going on. It's COVID. It's the dreaded C word. So I'm a little bit kind of like throaty. But yeah, so training has been something I've always loved. And I kind of, if I track back through my entire career, I had like 15 years in corporate as a senior manager. But invariably, I'd be the one that would end up on a stage in front of the whole kind of like staff team talking about things. And I love that. I love taking complex stuff, simplifying it down and explaining it to people. I just love doing that. So training's always been a thing for me. Gender diversity started for me with a dislike, an inherent, like inbuilt dislike and repulsion around gender disparity. so between men and women. And so in the corporate world, I experienced a lot of kind of sexism, or certainly assumptions and projections on how I should behave because I was a woman. And I found that really quite uncomfortable. And I noticed that some behaviors that other people were allowed to do, like swearing in the boardroom, were frowned on when I did it. And I didn't really like that. And so it started me down a journey of investigating what really is the difference between us, like really, like, you know, kind of why do we allow boys some things and girls other things, and why do we have these assumptions? And I kind of started down that road. And one of the things I came across on my path was a lot of professors in the biology space, essentially saying that sex isn't binary. Like, so, I mean, I had this understanding that gender isn't binary, you know, and there are lots of different gender kind of manifestations and expressions, but that biological sex was not binary. And I was a bit like, what? Like, what? And so I went on this huge kind of like rabbit hole tangent, where I just started researching biological sex and its non-binary nature, and doing loads of investigation, and essentially totally satisfied myself that biological sex wasn't binary. And then I think, you know, that's when I started overlaying it with gender diversity or gender identity, and started thinking, hold on, neither of these things are binary. Maybe they actually tie up in some way. Maybe there is a physiological underpinning to our felt gender identity and experience. So yeah, that was my little path into this arena. And the more I've gone along the path, the more passionate I've become, the more stuff I found that has just totally exploded what I thought I knew into smithereens. Yeah, so now I'm really passionate about sharing that.
Wow, that is great. That is pretty fascinating. And that's really, I'm glad you brought up just the fact that biological sex is also a spectrum, because that's really one of the things that has fascinated me about your work. I as well have long known that gender was a spectrum, but kind of still had in my head that, you know, biological sex was binary. And more and more information has come out, more and more research and studies kind of showing, improving, giving various examples of biological sex being a spectrum as well. And I know that you often use a lot of examples from nature to highlight this, to show that it's not even just humans with our big brains coming up with this idea, but that there are also examples in the animal kingdom. And I'll kind of lead into that a little bit. So I've read that there is and you've talked about that there's a pride of lions that's been observed in Botswana, where there's a group of female lions who began to grow manes and act more like the male lions. And the alpha trans lion grew the biggest mane. And could you talk about that a little bit? Is there anything big I'm leaving out, or, you know, are they still being observed?
Yeah, it's fascinating. So, I mean, if you do a Google search on lioness with mane, you'll find lots of examples. So it's not just the one pride, but I like that one pride because of, yeah, how it essentially evidences that there was something that happened in that environment and in the social structure. And like, we'll get on to kind of like the whats and hows of this. But at the same point in time, 5 lionesses started growing manes and started doing things like marking their territory and roaring, which are kind of like more male kind of behaviors. And they were fighting a bit more, but of infighting happening. And yeah, there was definitely this point where one of them kind of won. So there was this like sparring between these 5 lionesses that were all growing manes, and the one that won, her mane continued to grow, whereas the ones that didn't win, their manes receded and shrank back. So it was like, it wasn't like there was something genetic that happened, that these 5 lionesses suddenly passed some kind of pubescent point or something, and something changed in their physiology. There was a point at which all 5 of them somehow went as if to do something. One of them won, and then the others went back. So there's a really interesting kind of suggestion there of some kind of fluidity and some kind of changeability in biological sex. And so, and we see this in all sorts of different species. So in orangutans, there's a fluidity to their secondary sexual characteristics. So their cheeks get bigger when they win the fight, and they shrink when they lose the fight. And so they're more male or less male, depending on what's happening with their social structure and social environment. So yeah, there's this really interesting thing. And there's lots of other lionesses where there are manes have developed. And I think something that's really interesting is researchers often say, well, there's obviously some kind of testosterone variation, as if that means that it's not anything to do with like a transition or a something. Whereas my sense is that hormones fluctuate, stress hormones fluctuate, sex hormones fluctuate, and they can fluctuate based on an internal thing that they're reacting to, but they can also change in relation to external environment. And so this idea that hormonal variations might result in changes to our physiology is something that I think there's loads of room for us to investigate with the human species. Yeah.
That's pretty
Wow,
cool.
that is very interesting. Vanessa, were you going to say something?
I was just saying that's pretty cool.
Yeah, and also just the complexity that you're bringing up of not just something genetic, something environmental, perhaps both, perhaps a combination. That is quite a trip. And I'm wondering too, so you mentioned lions and orangutans. Are there any other animals that you'd like to kind of point out that have these changes?
Hyenas are interesting as well. So I mean, hyenas are a perfect example of how, like, we have this sense that a penis and a vagina are two totally different physical structures, and they're just like nothing like the same. And so the baby in the womb goes down this like path which either goes pink or blue, penis or vagina, and it turns out it's just not that straightforward at all. And so when you actually look, there's a great diagram I've got actually of a clitoris and a penis. They're the same thing. They're identical. Like, literally, their physical structure, the way that they literally, the whole thing, like, is they're just identical. And so in hyenas, both male and female hyenas have penises. In the female, they're called a pseudo penis, but actually they look identical. And what happens is when a female hyena mates with a male hyena, she rolls up her pseudo penis so that she can actually mate with the male. When two female hyenas mate, which happens quite regularly, they kind of have to have a choice who rolls up and who doesn't. So it's kind of like this really interesting kind of fluidity and physiological kind of like adaptability, that I think, when we go back to what we've been taught in school, in primary and secondary school biology, we were taught something that was so simplistic that this kind of blows our mind. But it's so naturally evident. And intersex black bears is another species where there's a lot of examples. Again, if you search bears and intersex bears, I mean, it's the same with polar bears and grizzly bears, but there's one particular one that I reference a lot, an intersex black bear, where she has a vagina, but the anterior wall of her vagina is also developed into a penis, so she has both. She's kind of hermaphroditic. But she's had babies, so she's got pregnant, she's given birth, her mammae are lactating, she is feeding her young, and so she's intersex, so she has a combination of vagina and penis. And in bears, that's quite common. And in some bears, they actually mate and give birth through the penis-like structure that has developed from the clitoris. So it's actually through that kind of like pseudo penis that they're mated with, and then through that device that they actually give birth. So it's mind-blowing when we get into the natural world and we see all of this variability and all of this kind of fluidity and changeability and non-binariness of biological sex.
It's almost like human social constructs have just made all of this up,
isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, it is. And I think one of the things that's often leveled at this whole thing is that hermaphroditism or intersex or kind of anything that isn't strictly kind of like XXXY penis vagina kind of scenario is a small number. I don't think it's as small as people think. There are some really interesting studies that, I mean, essentially, to my mind, based on the research I've done, we're looking at a minimum of 1 in 500 people. And it's actually probably closer to 1 in 50, depending on what you include under the intersex umbrella. So 1 in 50 is the same number of people who have red hair in the world. It's a lot of people. It's a lot of people. And Yeah, and then when we looked at the animal kingdom, I'm not surprised if you search intersex bear or if you search lioness with mane, you will find lots and lots of examples, both in captivity and in the wild. It seems quite a normal phenomenon.
Yes. Well, it sounds like I've got some Googling to do, because that is
Yeah.
all very interesting. And it also, I mean, regarding so you were, kind of mentioned a few examples there. I mean, I kind of am thinking, feel like I could watch The Lion King and get a totally different read of it now. But, but I think that, it's interesting because I feel like humans often, if there's any discussion around intersex, which there's not a lot because we don't talk about it, but if there is, it's generally that is corrected, right? It is corrected through, without any doubt, a non-consensual surgery on a very, very young person. And it's, what I find unique about what you're mentioning about black bears is that they reproduce, that they, have a full biological capacity. And it really kind of, has me start to think about, oh, what if we maybe didn't mess with people who are born that way, and, maybe just left them be and let them decide what they wanted to do at a later time, right? But
there's some amazing TEDx talks actually where there's one, but I can't remember the name of the person that does it. But yeah, her parents essentially like really pressured and pressured and pressured for her to have an operation, like, saying your daughter will not have a satisfying sex life, your daughter will not find a husband, your daughter will never be physically okay, your daughter will have psychological issues. And they had to resist to not have, their daughter operated on. From the point that their daughter hit, I can't remember if it was 16, 17 or 18, but they stopped contacting the parents and started contacting her saying, you have to have an operation, there is something physically wrong with you, you need this operation. And she continued to resist. The operation, is now happily married, is living really, really happily. There have been no problems, but the pressure that is put on the parents of intersex children to have them operated on is really quite shocking. And it's interesting there was one major study done that essentially kind of looked at all the global evidence from about 45 years to come up with this number of 1 in 50 people being intersex and somehow not fitting scientific criteria. And I think it was criticized by one person in particular that kind of like tore it down, said these numbers are ridiculous. And it's like, the minimum number that I've managed to come up with, even like I think the UK stats of 1 in 300 people are operated on close to birth to make their genitals fit male or female, because their genitals are either a combination, so they're either a combination of penis and vagina, or it might be that the gonads and the genitals don't match, so it might be testes and a vagina, or ovaries and a penis, or the genitals themselves are kind of indistinguishable. They're not really anything in terms of one or the other. And so these operations, 1 in 300 people in the UK, the last stat I saw, but certainly between 1 in 500 and 1 in 1,000 people, wherever you are in the world, are being operated on at birth to make them male or female and to fit this binary biological sex construct.
It's horrible.
Yeah.
And therein lies the construct. So
yeah, totally. It's it's really hard to understand how, given how constructual it all is, kind of like how we hang so much off it in society that we do. Yeah, it's quite unbelievable.
Well, let's pivot a little bit to talk about the brain, because that's another. I saw a post that you had made a while ago, and it was talking about brain science. So I know you know a little about this. You had posted about some studies showing how, or maybe a study specifically, I'm not 100% sure, showing how pathways in the brain differ for transgender individuals. And I'm curious to know like how that corresponds to the idea of nature versus nurture, which we talked a little bit with the lions. Like the idea that, are people born this way with differently wired brains, or is this something that develops throughout their lifetime, or do we have enough information to know that conclusively at this point?
Yeah, okay. So it was really, there was one study that I've referenced that was done in 2019, which was groundbreaking in what it showed. So first off, something that's quite interesting to understand is that estrogen is actually responsible for the way that the brain develops. So, and the way that the brain patterning happens in terms of its likelihood to be kind of on the masculine end of the scale or the feminine end of the scale. So it can be interesting when we talk about brain science, because it's kind of, there's been a lot of studies to show that essentially there isn't such a thing as a male brain or a female brain. It's just not that straightforward. Like everything, it's on a spectrum. And so I like to think of, when I'm talking about masculine or feminine, I try to use the terms yin and yang, if they're terms you're familiar with. So it's kind of like yin being kind of like almost soft, feminine, gentle, kind of those kind of energies, with yang being the stronger, fiercer, more assertive kind of energies. And so if we look at all of the people assigned female at birth and put them over there, and all of the people assigned male over birth, and we assigned male at birth, and we put their kind of like brain patternings into kind of like a thing, and we look at, there will be a small difference, you know? So, I mean, not as much as might have been implied. We're not different species, we're the same species, and it's all on a spectrum, but there is a difference. When we look at transgender individuals, and this, what this study did is it looked at these estrogen signaling pathways in the brain that create either a male yang patterning or a female yin patterning. And what they found was that in transgender individuals, there were lots of different ways that these pathways varied that wasn't evidence in cisgender people. So in the control group of cisgender people, these variations were not evident at all, just not to be seen. And also in very large controlled DNA databases, they weren't to be seen, apart from in a very small group. So there are a small group of people who are saying, you know, from 3, 4, 5 years old, I'm somehow not in the right body, I am in the wrong body, that actually it turns out their brain patterning is kind of at the extreme opposite end to where their body is. So if they were assigned male at birth, their brain patterning is actually right down the yin end of the brain patterning spectrum. Or if they're assigned female at birth, their brain patterning is right down the yang end of the brain patterning spectrum. And this is all to do with what happens with estrogen in the development of the baby. And I think the easiest way to explain it is that genitalia and the brain develop at different points in that kind of like cycle. So the body will be developing, the genitalia will develop, and I'm not sure which way around it is, but the one will develop, and then something will shift in the estrogen signaling pathways, and the brain or the genitals will then develop in the opposite way. And so literally we are talking about a physiological brain difference for people who are experiencing themselves as not in alignment with the sex they've been assigned at birth, which makes total sense. And when people talk about biological sex being binary, you know, not only do we have intersex people, but we now have this evidence that would suggest that trans binary people who want to swap from one to the other also have a physiological underpinning for that. Which means that, you know, kind of, we're definitely not talking about a society where we're just men and women. There is evidence that shows that we're so much more than that, and it's much more complicated.
Wow. Yes. So much more complex. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, Vanessa, you've even touched on, you know, as you have started to take the hormone therapy, that you've noted some differences. And I've heard this from other trans folks as well, and I've experienced this myself. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, that just makes so much sense. I've heard that before too, but like, because you see trans people in all different walks of life, and you're not just seeing, you know, trans people being super left wing. And I mean, I've had the thoughts that I was in the wrong body since I was a little kid. And since I've started estrogen, I like to say that my brain had been craving estrogen for 40 years, but my body was producing testosterone. So now that I fixed that problem, everything's become much more clear. Everything's been aligned, and yeah, it just makes so much more sense that the estrogen is what I've needed my entire life, and now that I have it, everything clicks.
It
That
makes
really,
sense as well when we look at something like stress hormones. That
mm,
we understand that adrenaline, noradrenaline, cortisol, serotonin, dopamine, we know that they change, they affect how we feel. It makes total sense that like kind of the hormones that might have been around when our brain was developing, all of that, that there is some kind of like actual real tie in there to like kind of
mhm.
what we need, what our body needs, how our body feels, that is way more complicated. And I don't even think we really understand sex hormones as well as we need to, like how kind of it's not a female hormone and a male hormone. Like there's a lot of stuff being done at the moment with kind of menopause showing that women need testosterone in menopause. It's kind of like, and how, we were just talking about estrogen being required for the masculinization of the brain. And there's also, I wrote it down actually, kind of what was the name of the androstenedione, which is the precursor to estrogen and testosterone. I mean, what's that? What's that? What are our different levels? And so in one of the sets of lions, actually, when they were looking at, does this lioness that's got a mane have higher levels of testosterone? And she didn't, but what she did have was higher levels of cortisol and the androstenedione. So yeah, there's all these different hormones. So again, I think understanding the hormone profiles and understanding the way that the brain works is a huge part of gender and sex science that we're only really starting to look at now. And I think that's where the natural world helps us to go, yeah, this is not just a human thing. And there is definitely something physiological going on here.
Right, absolutely. And I think it also lends to that, that idea of sometimes trans people are criticized of, oh, this is all in your head. Well, it's like, well, yes, actually, it is.
Yes.
It is in my head. Yes, it is part of my brain. Yes, that is
Yeah.
actually accurate. Let me like turn that right back around.
Exactly. And I think if somebody said, like, I'm stressed, we wouldn't say, well, hold on a minute, you're not sweating, your pupils aren't dilated. We'd go like, okay, you've told me you're stressed, I'm going to believe you. So it's kind of the same with a trans person saying, like, I don't feel the way I might look on the outside. And then people saying, well, we don't believe you because you look like that on the outside, so you must feel like this on the inside. And it's like, wow, when are we going to divorce this idea that we should be able to tell how somebody feels by looking at them? Be that how stressed they are, or be that, kind of how okay they are with their own gender. It's kind of crazy that looking at somebody, we should be able to read their internal world. And why wouldn't we just trust how people tell us they feel? Like,
Yes, that's a pretty vital question. Why would we not believe people? Yes.
Because we live in a society.
Yes. Yes. Well, it's not a lot of
certain
focus
ideas.
yeah. Well, so that actually kind of, speaking of society, that I'm curious about, you've mentioned some things about different cultures. And I've heard quite a bit about, there's definitely been different talks about two-spirit culture in the Native American community here. And I have heard of some other examples that are, some of which are, I think, earlier in history. But you've also mentioned that there are current cultures, like right now in the world, that are more accepting of more complex ideas of gender and sex. And I think in the, here in the West, here in America and in Europe a lot, I feel like there's, it's just such a conversation about, men and women and focus on that. And, trans is not real and all of this crap. And like, I feel like we don't talk about as much here, the current cultures that exist right now in the world who really do acknowledge a more complex gender and sex structure. So do you have any examples of that you could share?
Nepal is quite a good one. So back in 2007, they became the first country to legally recognize a third gender. And so, there's 20 odd different cultures right now in the world that recognize more than two genders, like as just standard de facto, just totally not abnormal. But yeah, that was interesting for me that was in 2007 that Nepal chose to legally recognize the metis. And the metis in Nepal are people who are assigned male at birth, but who assume the carriage and mannerisms and appearance and dress of women. But they don't consider themselves gay. They consider themselves a third gender who are attracted to straight men. And that's how they're recognized in the whole of the society. That's how they're seen. It's totally normal. It's like, you're metis, okay. And everybody understands this. So yeah, so that's one that I really like, because I think it's great that that's actually now legally recognized, because I think that's, that's where this can kind of get complicated, because even though people know how they feel and we can change documents and things like that, I think it's without the legal recognition, it makes life incredibly difficult.
Yes.
So that's a great one. And then the other one that I absolutely love, I mean, based on all the research I've done, I mean, this tribe seems to have it totally right to me, and it's the Bugis people, and they're in Sulawesi in Indonesia. And they recognize 3 sexes, so male, female, and intersex, which, as far as I can tell, that is what we are biologically, male, female, or intersex. And then they recognize 5 genders. So they recognize male men, they recognize male women, they recognize female women, and they recognize female men, and they recognize non-binary people.
Wow.
So they recognize those 5 different genders. And so someone who's born male could arguably, be any of the 3. So either male man, they could be male woman, or they could be non-binary. And then anybody born and assigned female could be any one of the corresponding 3, or somebody born intersex could go in any one of the directions that felt right for them. And it's all just totally understood. So yeah, Bisu is the name given to non-binary people in that locale. But I think, you referenced ancient cultures as well. But if we go back to like the Talmud and the Kabbalah, some of the ancient Jewish texts that precede the Bible, they talk about intersex and transgender people like it's totally normal. So yeah, it's interesting. It's like these current cultures that recognize more than 2 genders, they're actually just holding on to the way we were, and they haven't had the binary gender construct come in and overly overlaid to the degree that they've forgotten where they came from.
Right. Wow. That is really fascinating. I feel like I never got that. Definitely never got that from my biblical readings as a young child. So
No.
maybe another thing to Google.
Yeah, definitely. The Talmud and the Kabbalah on intersex and transgender is very interesting. And actually, the Jewish community, I've seen that there are some places where the rabbi are incredibly supportive of the youth who are going through transition, and incredibly supportive of them in that journey. So yeah.
Yes, I've experienced that as well with the Jewish community, especially with the more, obviously the more progressive parts of the Jewish community are very, they would actually say that to be trans is to be more holy, or, it is something to be revered and looked up to. So that's, but I have not actually done the research on the Talmud and things like that. So that'll be something else to look into.
That is the history, though. The history of intersex and transgender and non-binary is that they were the spiritual leaders. They were the ones who were believed to be closer to God, because they had both an even balance of yin and yang within them. So they were both all and everything. So, and I think if we track back to ancient religions where they would have like maybe a priest or a priestess, if it was a priestess, they would dress as a priest. If they were a priest, they would dress as a priestess. And actually the bringing in of both genders or both binary kind of ways into a more non-binary kind of presence was something that was revered, absolutely, and celebrated and lauded, and very much recognized as a good thing.
Yes. Wow. Yeah. Well, if I could wish, that would be great if our society would look to that a little bit more, instead of the way that we are currently being addressed and posited there. But so that idea of cultures, I had that idea of bringing that up as a question because I had I saw a post that you made that had a map from, I think it was PBS or something, that was a really interesting
the public
map.
Broadcasting Service. Yes.
So so that that post, I noticed, got a whole lot of attention because, you know, gender is just such a hot topic. And one other thing I wanted to ask you about is really how you approach bringing up these kind of topics in such a public forum. I mean, I know you have your course, which I like will touch on a little bit before we end, but I've noticed that, you know, you're delving into such a touchy topic. And I feel like the way that you help facilitate discourse in the comments is very open and pretty open-minded, and really trying to get people to discuss. And then, of course, sometimes there's a point where, you know, it's really evident that like this is not going anywhere good and we have to cut it off. But I mean, it's really admirable, honestly, how you've been approaching that and kind of having that discourse. So I just wanted to ask, like, when somebody challenges your views online, how do you decide whether it's worth it to engage with them or not, you know, or whether it's better to kind of like shut it down before it gets really nasty, you know, really hateful?
I have a phrase that someone gave me a long time, two phrases actually that feel quite important. One is that we should move through life as if we're moving through a wheat field or a, you know, some kind of grain crop field, and that it's our job to move through without bruising any of that crop, you know. And so I have this sense, I don't want to bruise anybody else, even if it's just in my reaction to the way they're being. I don't want to bruise anybody. So even if someone's trying to bruise me, I'm still going to try and sidestep slightly, not to bruise them back. So I think that's really important for me in terms of how I want to conduct myself, because that's how I would rather people conduct themselves. So we have to kind of be the change we wish to see, right? And try and set a standard in that way. And the other one that I think is kind of like why I sometimes hold on past the point that others might not, is that someone said to me, home is a much nicer place when everyone is gathered there. And I know that seems a bit corny, but I have this idea that wouldn't it be nice if everyone could agree? I don't want us to end up, you know, on two sides of the bridge hurling stones at each other, and this side wins and that side loses. I just want everyone to come over the bridge. You know, I want everyone to come over. And I have this sense that when I do eventually just go, nope, that's it, we're not getting anywhere here today, I would still love it if that person might come back in a year's time. So I still would like to end it nicely so that they might come back, you know, when they maybe learn something else, or something else drops, or the seed that we planted on that post, you know, grows a little bit, that they would still feel welcome to return to continue the conversation. And so, yeah, I've got about 10 people who are now really supportive followers, who, when they first came onto one of my posts, were like, yeah, this is all absolute nonsense. And now they're following me, they're following my work, and they'll occasionally tag me in posts that people in their network have like said something, and they'll tag me in. And I think it's about the groundswell. We talked about it before we went live. I think this idea that, you know, through creating a mass of a raising of understanding and awareness of the actual truth around biological sex, gender identity, and the fluidity of it all and everything else, I think we'll create a kind of like a size of a movement that it will be undeniable, you know, whereas every person I cut off before I've had that little chance to try and win them into the ally camp, you know, I kind of feel like, no, I give people a little bit longer than most would, I think. But yeah, and I have had some really great, each one of those I take as a huge personal success, you know, just like one person that comes from being really grumpy, really anti, really like, you know, radically opposed to anything other than male or female. I love it when they turn. I love it. It's it means a lot more than the thousands and thousands of people who totally get what I'm saying, going, yeah, great, you're great. I'm like, yeah, well, that's brilliant. Of course you think that, like,
Right.
yeah,
You're already there, right? Yeah, that's well, that's really cool. I love that you've, you know, kind of given a little insight into how you think about that. And like I said, it's just I find it admirable, because it's I think a lot of times it's easier to shut people down, and sometimes it feels a little necessary and self-protective. But you know what you kind of hit on there, excuse me, is the other binary, which is the binary between us and them, right?
Yes.
And I think that that is really what I feel like. And I think even people who would totally disagree with us about sex and gender, you know, some other people can see that like that is one of the things that really is kind of tearing our emotional world apart right now. So I think it's really great to have that thought, you know, about the bridge of like, you know, let's all cross the bridge together. Even if we're not looking in the same place, you know, even if we're not 100% on the same page, you know, how can we bring it together and not be so divided into that major binary of us and them.
Yeah, not burn the bridges. That's the thing. Yeah, let's not go around burning bridges. Let's leave the bridges and just gradually tempt people over.
Right. Right. I love that idea. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, well, another question for you. This is a little more personal. How has all of this research on gender affected you personally and your, you know, your relationship with yourself and your own identity?
That's so massive. So it never even dawned on me to question my own gender. Like, who knew? And so, yeah, I started on this journey. It was back about 2016 that I really started picking it all apart. And then I suppose I don't even know which day it was, but one day I went, oh, isn't that funny? Maybe I'm non-binary. I was like, gosh, maybe I'm non-binary. And it suddenly started to make sense of my whole life. And I've had several of my school friends who've actually said, oh, yeah, that makes total sense. I'm like, yeah, it makes total sense. It makes just total sense. So yeah, I mean, I'm really drawn to go over to Sulawesi to meet the Bugis people to find out, you know, can someone like who is like assigned female at birth be Bisu? Because I honestly think if I'd been born in their society, I'd have been spotted as Bisu from like kind of this high. Um, so yeah, I think it's really interesting what it's done for me, and it's just been incredible. So I think I kind of sometimes lightly say that I identify as non-binary because having looked behind the veil, looked behind the curtain, and I can see that biological sex isn't binary, gender identity isn't binary. Why would I give myself a label that really kind of fits everybody into that kind of binary construct? It doesn't make any sense to me anymore. So it's a bit of a statement. But it is also very much how I feel. And so it's really interesting. And a lot of my friends still call me my birth name, Cheryl. A lot of my friends still she, her, me. I still call myself Cheryl sometimes. I still she, her myself. But when someone calls me Shay and when people they, them, me, I can't even stop then. I just feel so much happier. And when I remember like to do it for myself, you know, it's just, it feels so right. Um, but yeah, I think we do all still live in a world where, you know, I'm here being very brave on the internet, but it's kind of like I'm almost braver on LinkedIn than I am like with my own family and my own friends. And yeah, it's an interesting place to find myself. And I feel like I'm in transition whilst the world is in transition. And I hope that there will be a future where for me to transition totally and be in this new total place would be something everyone would accept about me, without feeling like I need to close doors on friendships and things like that, which,
Right.
yeah, it feels like it's hard not to have to do that given the background level of misunderstanding in the world at the minute. It's very hard. So, yeah, all of my research has led me into some really interesting places. I understand myself so much better now. I look at the me trying to fit in and I cringe at some of the me trying to be a good girl or a good woman or a good wife or a good, you know, all of those things. And yeah, I have two children myself. They're both boys, and I really hope that the future for them and for their kids, if they have kids, and for their friends, will be one where they can just be who on earth they feel like being, without judgment from anyone for that. Because I think, yeah, I imagine my childhood now, and I think, gosh, that could have been more joyous. It could have been more uniquely me being me rather than me trying to be something that didn't really fit. So, yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing all of that. That is, I mean, that makes sense with all the research you've done that has led to that introspection. And I totally feel you on the you know, there is something about an online presence that is, even though you're not anonymous, I mean, especially on LinkedIn, it's you're not using like a handle that's, you know, some combination of alphanumeric characters, but that, you know, it is your first name and your last name, and they can, you know, people can see like where you worked and generally where you live and things like that. But there is still kind of a veil of anonymity that is there that is a lot different than having a conversation with someone in the same physical space and a conversation with someone who has known you your whole life, or you've known them their whole life. I mean, it is a different, it's definitely a different set of stakes for sure going on there. So that's interesting. And I think, you know, generally, I mean, what you said about your kids is like, I think all parents they just want their kids to be loved and to have a good life, you know, ultimately. That's every parent's dream, right? So that makes sense. And I'm sure that, hey, there are certain ways that you have to be paving the way for your boys to be taking that on, just in what you have decided to do and this career that you have built for yourself. So
I've just come back from a lovely little local festival, and my boy and one of his friends, in fact, two of his friends, got involved in a dance routine with all the girls. Like everyone was just like breaking down barriers. And the one night everyone was getting dressed up, they had glitter all over their face, and yeah, it was really, really fun to see them busting down some of those boundaries and barriers I think society puts in the way, you know, the embarrassment, the kind of like the desire to conform, and to watch my son being part of a group of kids who are just busting all of that out there. It's I'm absolutely delighted. Yeah, bless them.
Yeah, it's wonderful. And I definitely think that the younger generation is very resistant to this rigid binary construct, very much. Gen Z for sure, but Gen Alpha, like, absolutely. You know, and conversations with younger kids, and even high school age kids, like they're just like, throw that right out the window. So
yeah,
I have hope for that for them
too.
Definitely. And I think like whether organizations are like, oh, we don't need to understand gender diversity. I'm like, oh, okay, so you're closing your business in the next 5 to 10 years, you're never going to need to employ Gen Z. Okay, that's great. Well, if that's your stance, that's wonderful.
right.
Yeah, bye business.
Yeah.
23% of Gen Z use a they them pronoun to some degree or other. 23% of Gen Z. Yeah.
Yes.
Beautiful.
Well, it is beautiful. And personally, I want to do everything I can to like bulldoze that down for them and like clear that path so that they can like keep going in whatever way feels right for them, you know? Yeah. So that's cool. Well, that kind of leads to my last question, which is about your course. So, you know, you recently launched this online course. Who did you have a particular person or set of people in mind when you were writing it? Yeah, and what, you know, and what can someone expect to learn from it?
Yeah, I'm a marketing person's nightmare, because if you say who's the course for, I don't do that. Yes, it's for these people. I think really what the course is it's a very, very top level overview and introduction to quite a lot of the stuff we've been talking about today, but in a really, really clear and easy to understand framework that I think is useful for a variety of people. Be it somebody who already understands all of this, but just doesn't know what I'm on about and wants to understand what I'm on about, so it can be useful for them. It's useful for somebody who doesn't understand a word of it, who just wants to kind of like find something that they can ground it. And I think I kind of talk in the course about how if you're trying to talk to someone who doesn't understand gender diversity at all, and you suddenly start talking about someone's right to be non-binary, there's nothing for them to ground that in or for them to root it in that makes any kind of conceptual sense to them. And so I think the whole course really is about introducing a framework and a way of helping people to understand this, that they can come along with, get on board with, and at the end of it go, yeah, I get it now. So yeah, and I mean, that could be somebody who's got an HR role within an organization, and maybe the gender piece is just something they're just not sure about. Or it could be that they do get it, but they wouldn't have to explain it to somebody else. And this framework will help them explain it to other people in a way that makes sense quickly and easily. So yeah, for anybody really. And also I know already that actually one of my friends showed it to somebody else that they knew, a kid that they know, and that kid is actually now recommended onto their parents. I don't know whether their parents, I hope their parents might watch it, because at home they're experiencing a lot of kind of denial of any of this being true or relevant in any way. So that's why the science and the natural world and the different culture stuff can be really helpful sometimes, because I think it takes it out of the realm of constructs and things that people are making up, into actual facts, facts, statistics, and science that are undeniable. So yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that definitely rings true. And I also sometimes just having someone who is removed from the situation, I mean, and definitely the scientific facts and the cultural facts help build that, build that, build that evidence for it. But also just, having someone present it that is not the person that those people who are resistant to those ideas are so attached to, and they're like, oh, wait, this is not just you. Like, and this is not just like the young people. And, it kind of starts to break down those barriers in that way.
Yeah.
So, and as you mentioned a couple of minutes ago, for businesses who are looking to stay in business and will need to be employing some of these younger, more open folks, this could be really useful. So, well, how would people find you online? How would they find your course?
Yeah, great. I mean, LinkedIn is where I hang out and share a lot of information for free. And I'm there in DMs, and anyone can book like a free 20-minute kind of like virtual couple with me if they've got some like questions around all of this. So that's my name there is Shay Barnes, CHE Barnes. So find me on LinkedIn. The other place is my website, and that's got kind of links to all the various things, including the course. And that's letstalkgender.co.uk.
All right.
And that's got everything on there, all the various bits and pieces. Yeah.
Wonderful. Listeners will be able to find all that information in the description.
Okay, great. Yes, we will add that information to the description of this episode.
Thank you.
Well, great. Well, I think we can wrap up now. Shay, thank you so much for joining us for this episode. For all of our listeners. Yeah, thank you so much. Really appreciate that. For all of our listeners, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. You can find this podcast on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and pretty much anywhere you get your podcasts. You can also access the audio files, the YouTube video, and audio transcripts directly on our site at transcendinghumanity.com, where we have links.
Wow.
And this is all Vanessa. I mean, I just have the spiel on this one because I've got the host hat on, but Vanessa is the fabulous person to set all of this up and keep it all going. And we have links on our site to become a patron as well if you would like to support the show, because we are currently self-funded. So I think that's about it. Thank you for joining us, and check us out next time.
Thank you for having me.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
You're so welcome.